Throughout every culture or branch of mythology, there is always at least one iconic hero, and in fact most of the time there are many more. Today we travel to Ireland to discuss Cú Chulainn, an Irish hero who has been likened to the Greek hero Achilles in terms of his reckless courage, the ability to inspire fear in his enemies, and his part mortal, part immortal persona. Cú Chulainn has gone by several names over the years, including Cú Chulainn, Cú Chulainn, and of course most commonly amongst Irish people as Cú Chulainn. His name itself meant Culann's hound, the name of a blacksmith that he would eventually serve. As we've already mentioned, he was an Irish hero, but he was also the central figure of the Ulster cycle, a series of legends and sagas that took place in medieval Ireland. Many believe that he was in fact the incarnation of his father, Lugh, the warrior and saviour of the Tuatha De Danann. His mother, on the other hand, was a mortal, making him what many would consider to be a demigod. His appearance is commonly described as a small young man with no beard and thick black hair. And then you have some truly peculiar and odd descriptions of him, my favourite of these being that his hair was brown at the base, blood red in the middle, with a crown of yellow surrounding it. He had 4 dimples in each cheek, yellow, green, crimson and blue, 7 bright pupils in each eye. Each foot had 7 toes and each hand had 7 fingers. His nails resembled a hawk's claw or a griffin's clench. Now as you can see, these depictions do vary quite dramatically, and it might have been a case of his image changing over time to appear more terrifying. Cú Chulainn is a figure that we can almost equate to an old Irish Incredible Hulk, as he would enter trances of superhuman rage, and once the need for violence and anger had come to an end, he would return to a much more gentle and sensitive being. These transformations became visible even from a very young age. When he first became part of a group of boys being trained at the fortress Macha, he ran onto the playing field, without asking for any of the elder boys' permission or protection. Unaware of this custom, the other boys saw this as a challenge of their abilities, and they began to attack our young hero. It's here that Cú Chulainn had what was known as a liastrad. This process is often described as a warp spasm, a truly disturbing transformation. His muscles would rapidly expand, his legs would twist themselves backwards, one eye would be sucked inside of his head, and the other one would fall outward, hanging from his face. His cheeks peeled themselves away from his mouth, revealing his jaw, and his internal organs were now visible. His hair would stand up in the shape of a spike, so strong that it could skewer an apple, and from his forehead would spurt streams of blood onto his enemies. In short, his body would turn itself inside out when driven into one of these fits of rage, and on this particular occasion, he proceeded to beat every single boy who attacked him with only one hand. It didn't take long before the boys would ask to be placed under Cú Chulainn's protection, or rather Setanta as he was known at that time. Cú Chulainn was not the name that he was born with, it was a name that he was later given. The name his mother gave him was Setanta. When the King of Ulster was invited to a banquet at the house of Chulainn the blacksmith, he asked his nephew Setanta to accompany him. When they arrived, Setanta joined in on a hurling game with some of the other boys. The king was so impressed by his nephew that he invited him to join in on the feast. Setanta accepted his uncle's request, but only once the game had finished, and unfortunately the king forgot to tell Chulainn of his nephew's invitation. When he saw a stranger approaching, he unleashed his ferocious hound. This stranger was of course Setanta, and after being attacked by the hound, he had no choice but to defend himself, eventually killing the dog. The way Setanta defeated the hound, like many things in Irish mythology, was quite graphic. Still holding the hurling ball from earlier, the boy flung the ball into the hound's throat, and then proceeded to smash the hound's head against the stone courtyard. When Chulainn saw what had happened to his hound, he was devastated. Setanta, wishing to atone for his actions, then promised to rear the smith a new hound, but until it came of age, he himself would protect Culann's house. The druid Cathbad then announced that the boy's name from this day would be Cú Chulainn, meaning Culann's hound. When training at Macha, the druid Cathbad was asked a very particular question, as to what the significance of the current day was, to which he replied that any warrior that took arms on this day would have everlasting fame and glory. Naturally, Cú Chulainn, overhearing this, went straight to his uncle and asked to take up arms despite only being 7 years old. When the druid saw the boy take arms, he began to immediately grieve, as the prophecy he had heard was not finished. Any warrior that took up arms on this day would be extremely famous, but in exchange his life would also be extremely short. Cú Chulainn was given the king's chariot, and he travelled to the sons of Necten Us, who had boasted of killing more Ulstermen than there were Ulstermen alive. When he eventually returned to the fortress, all of the men were terrified that his battle rage would kill them all. The king's wife devised a plan to distract him by leading the women of the Emain outside, bare-breasted, and for the most part this distraction worked, as the Ulstermen were able to wrestle him to the ground, throwing barrels of water on him until he cooled down and returned to his normal state. Despite how unpleasant Cuchulainn looked during his warp spasms, when he was a normal young man, he was described as possessing untold beauty, so much so that the other men of Ulster were worried that without his own wife he would attempt to take theirs. So they began to search all of the lands for a suitable wife. The only woman that they found that Cuchulainn showed any interest in was Emer, the youngest daughter of Forgal monarch. Now, as you can expect, Forgal, hearing of Cuchulainn's unpredictable nature, was against the idea and suggested that before he married his daughter, he travelled to Scotland in the land of Alba and trained with the renowned female warrior Skatak in hopes that the young warrior would be killed. Cuchulainn, not being one to back away from a challenge, accepted and travelled to Dun Scaith, otherwise known as the Fortress of Shadows, to begin his training. Forgal in the meantime planned to offer his daughter to Lugaid, one of the kings of Munster, but when the king had heard that Emer was in love with Cuchulainn, he refused to take her hand in marriage. Meanwhile, back in the Fortress of Shadows, Cuchulainn began to learn all of the arts of war, and it wasn't too long before his mentor came up against her fiercest rival in battle, Aoife. Skatak, fearing that the young boy was not ready for a battle of this magnitude, gave him a sleeping potion to keep him away. But because of his immense strength, this only worked for an hour or so, and he would eventually join the battle anyway. The two were very closely matched in battle, but Aoife became distracted when her horse fell off a cliff. With his sword to her throat, Cuchulainn chose not to kill her on one condition, that she bore him a son. So Cuchulainn, returning from Scotland with a child on the way, was expecting to marry Emer, but Forgal was still refusing to bless their union. So naturally Cuchulainn does what every rage-induced hero would do, and storms Forgal's fortress, killing 24 of his men, abducting Emer, and stealing all of Forgal's treasure along the way. It wasn't until around 8 years later that Connla, the son of Cuchulainn, and Aoife would come to Ireland looking for his father. When he refused to identify himself, the hero killed him, mistaking him to be an intruder. The boy's last words to his father were that they could have carried the flag of Ulster to Rome and beyond, leaving Cuchulainn stricken by the realization that he had slain his own son. Perhaps one of the hero's greatest achievements was single-handedly defending Ulster from the army of Connacht at the age of 17. The Queen of Connacht took the men of Ulster by surprise when our young hero failed to notice her army crossing the border because he was with a woman at the time. With the use of a curse, she managed to disable the men of Ulster. As the only man unaffected, Cuchulainn was the last line of defense, and he managed to stop the army advancing any further by invoking the right of single combat. He proceeded to defeat every single one of the Connacht champions that were thrown his way. One day after slaying one of the Connacht champions, a young woman appeared to him, claiming that she was the daughter of a king, and she offered him her love. When he refused, she reveals herself as the Morrigan, and swears revenge upon him. She appeared in several different forms attacking Cuchulainn, unable to best him, regardless of whatever form she took. With the Morrigan heavily wounded, she appeared to him one last time, as an elderly woman milking a cow. She offered him 3 drinks of milk, and for every one that he took she was further blessed, eventually healing her wounds entirely. During his closest combat yet, he barely managed to emerge victorious, leaving himself extremely wounded. He would visit the great warrior Lu, who healed his wounds, and also told him that he was in fact his father. When Cuchulainn returned, he saw that his uncle's army had attacked the army of Connacht, and lost. This sent him into his most severe and spectacular riastrad of all time. He charged into the opposing army, killing hundreds and building walls from their corpses. He single-handedly caused the army to retreat. With Cuchulainn cursed to die at a young age, that death would eventually come when 3 children of the men he killed conspired against him. In Ireland there were several taboos, and it was thought if someone was to break one of these taboos, they would become extremely weak, physically and spiritually. One of the biggest taboos was eating dog meat, but refusing one's hospitality was seen as even worse. So when he was approached by an old crone, offering him dog meat, he had no choice but to break one of these taboos and accept the food. This of course left him spiritually weakened, and there were 3 magical spears made. The first would kill his charioteer, the second his horse, and the third would mortally wound him. Knowing that his fate was unavoidable, he tied himself to a stone so he could die standing rather than on his knees. Despite giving everything he had to survive, one of the Morrigan's ravens would eventually land on his shoulder, showing his enemies that he was finally dead. When one of the men approached attempting to cut off his head, there was a beam of light that surrounded Cuchulainn. This beam of light burned the man's hand, causing him to drop his sword and cut off his own arm. This light continued to radiate around Cuchulainn until his sword arm was cut from his body. The legends of Cuchulainn are still told to this day, the Irish hero of immense strength and power. We essentially have this Jekyll and Hyde figure who was feared by so many despite being so young. I've only told you a handful of his adventures because there were so many, but I'd love to hear what you guys think. Feel free to share any thoughts and ideas with me in the comments below. And as always, I've been your host, Mythology and Fiction Explained.